Not all killers look like monsters. Some wear uniforms, some drive trucks, some smile when they pass you in the parking lot. From 1990 to 1999, 5 of the most ruthless serial killers in the United States moved through normal life while stacking bodies in silence. They weren't chaotic. They were careful. Each one studied their victims, chose the perfect moment, and made sure there was no second chance. Before we dive into these monsters, let us know in comment where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And if you want to hear more disturbing killer stories next time again, subscribe us. Keith Hunter Jesperson was one of those killers who made death look quiet. Standing at 6 feet 6 with a heavy-set frame, Jesperson was a long-haul trucker who treated the open road like a hunting ground. His roots gave him access to dozens of states, rest stops, and transient populations that often went unnoticed. He didn't kill in neighborhoods. He didn't follow people home. He picked them up in places where no one asked questions: truck stops, parking lots, roadside diners, and hitchhiking zones. Women traveling alone, often with nowhere to be, became targets the moment they stepped into his cab. Jesperson didn't scream. He didn't use weapons with noise or blood. He killed with grip and timing. Strangulation was his method of control. Either his bare hands, nylon cords, or whatever was nearby became a tool for cutting breath without a trace. Once his hands were on the neck, there was no hesitation, no second thoughts. He compressed the windpipe with pressure he understood well, calculated pressure that ensured not just unconsciousness, but death. His knowledge of the human body wasn't medical. It was physical. He had practiced. He knew the signs, the twitching limbs, the gasps, the final stillness. He didn't let go early. He didn't risk a mistake. And once the body was motionless, he waited longer, holding the position until the chest stopped moving. There was nothing emotional about it. No panic, no remorse. Jesperson called it cleanup. The cab of his truck was his chamber, dark, padded, isolated. Once inside, no one could hear anything. He often pulled over at dead spots on the interstate, places where the highway curved into forest, or ran past old industrial zones. He timed his stops. He waited for the roads to empty and for the sky to go black. His cab was spotless. He cleaned constantly, not out of guilt, but to erase trace. No hairs, no fibers, no stains. He used gloves. He wore plain clothes. His truck interior had no flashy markers, no bumper stickers, no identifiers that could link him to a place or belief. He stayed generic by design, and it worked. His first known victim, Tanja Bennett, was murdered in 1990. After dumping her body down a remote embankment in Oregon, Jesperson went on with his life. Meanwhile, the police arrested and charged 2 completely unrelated individuals due to a false confession. Jesperson read the news with disbelief and rage. He didn't just want to kill, he wanted credit. That was when the smiley faces began. Jesperson started sending anonymous letters to law enforcement and newspapers, taunting them with confessions signed with a crude, smiley face. He faxed notes to TV stations. He wrote on bathroom walls at gas stations. Each message gave away just enough information to prove he knew things no one else could. He didn't reveal everything. He gave pieces. And each time, a smiley face, mocking, cartoonish, and out of place beside a list of dead women. That's how the media named him the Happy Face Killer. What they didn't know yet was that this man had no fixed location. He didn't operate in a town. He operated on wheels. That gave him time, flexibility, and the power to disappear after every body. He'd kill in one state, drive 600 miles, and dump the body in another. Police departments couldn't connect the dots. There were no matching fingerprints, no direct witnesses, no consistent jurisdiction. He didn't stick to one profile. Some victims were sex workers, some were runaways, some were just desperate for a ride. He picked them up, made small talk, waited until they trusted him enough to fall asleep, then turned executioner. Sometimes he'd pull off the road mid-conversation and strike. Other times he waited until they were lying on the small bed in the back of the cab. The violence wasn't messy, it was structured. Even his body dumps followed patterns. Remote wooded areas, commercial dumpsters behind vacant lots, culverts off dead-end highways. Nothing high profile, nothing that drew attention fast. Jesperson didn't just disappear physically, he erased traces. He wiped surfaces with alcohol, wore gloves when handling belongings, and often dumped the victim's bags. Far from the body, he didn't keep souvenirs, he didn't trophy hunt. Once it was over, it was discarded. He moved on to the next haul, the next city, the next mile marker. What made him more dangerous was his patience. He could go weeks between killings. He didn't rush. He waited for the perfect setting. And every time he struck, he left behind no clear motive, no relationship to the victim, no signature injuries that screamed serial killer. Strangulation left little forensics if done right, and Jesperson made sure it was. Every kill was a quiet performance in control, not of blood or chaos, but of certainty. He didn't hope they were dead, he knew. And once the breathing stopped, he wasn't shaken. He was calm. He folded up their belongings, cleaned the cab again, checked his logs, and got back on the road. The only thing left behind was a corpse and a signature face, smiling. Keith Hunter Jesperson didn't stop because he grew tired of killing. He stopped because he got sloppy. His murders spanned across multiple states, but the thing about covering that much ground is that eventually, somewhere, a pattern begins to emerge. Even if the killer thinks he's staying ahead of it. After the murder of Townsha Bennett, Jesperson continued to pick up victims across his trucking routes, mostly targeting women who wouldn't be reported missing right away. He dumped bodies in places where local law enforcement had no reason to link the cases, but the smiley face letters changed that. What began as an anonymous attempt to claim credit for one murder slowly became an uncontrollable compulsion to talk. Jesperson didn't know how to stay silent anymore. The urge to brag, to feel clever, superior, was growing stronger than his ability to hide. He sent letters with vivid details only the killer could know, but still made sure they couldn't trace them directly to him. That worked for a while, but not forever. One of his later victims, Angela Sue Bryce, was different. He had picked her up at a truck stop in Washington. After killing her, Jesperson made a mistake. He dumped her body but chose to get rid of her belongings separately, mailing her ID and personal effects from one state to another. That brought in federal attention. The FBI began to get involved. The fragmented local reports from different jurisdictions started connecting dots thanks to Postal Service records and timelines from truck stop camera logs. But Jesperson remained unaware that the circle was closing. He believed he was still in full control. He killed another woman, Julie Winningham, a woman he briefly dated, and left her in a remote spot near Washougal, Washington. But this time, he didn't cover his tracks as carefully. Witnesses remembered them being together. Surveillance footage placed his truck in the area, and police were finally starting to notice a trend in his movements. Jesperson's fatal flaw was ego. He started writing more letters, longer letters, even including maps and sketches. At one point, he mailed a letter directly to the authorities with directions to one of his dump sites. He wanted them to see the scope of what he had done, not just for acknowledgement, but because he believed he was smarter than them. His pride began to compromise his planning. In 1995, the weight of it all started pressing in. He was facing pressure from within his own life. His relationships were collapsing, and suspicion was beginning to grow. Jesperson feared being arrested not just for one murder, but for all of them. That's when he wrote a full confession letter to his brother. It detailed the killings, the feelings, and the method. He mailed it and waited. He thought maybe turning himself in would give him power again. He went to a police station in Washington and confessed to murdering Julie Winningham. At first, they didn't believe him. They thought it was a false confession. But then he provided details, maps, items, and photographs only the killer would have seen. The investigation confirmed his claims. From there, everything unraveled. Jespersen was linked to at least 8 confirmed murders, though he claimed responsibility for as many as 160. Authorities didn't believe that number, but even the 8 revealed a terrifying pattern of precision and predation. His truck routes were cross-checked with missing persons cases. Several unsolved murders began to align with his logs. Though evidence was hard to come by, he rarely left anything behind. A combination of witness statements, forensic analysis of the truck interiors, and timeline matches tied him to multiple victims. His willingness to speak became a major part of the prosecution. Jespersen never begged for mercy. He didn't deny anything. He offered confession after confession, almost as if reliving the kills gave him satisfaction. He described how long it took to strangle someone. He explained the silence in their eyes. He described the difference between a panic kill and a calm one, and how he only did the latter. There was no plea for forgiveness, only facts. His trial didn't take long. With his own words used as evidence and several physical locations confirmed by his descriptions, Jespersen was convicted of multiple counts of murder. He received multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. In prison, he continued to write. He sent letters to journalists, crime authors, and even amateur investigators. Each letter came with more stories, some confirmed, some likely fabricated, but all with the same tone of eerie calm and control. Jespersen never saw himself as insane. He saw himself as smarter than the system. That was the most chilling part. He didn't kill in a frenzy. He didn't lose control. He took it. Each murder was a test of timing, patience, and physical superiority. He said he killed because it gave him peace. The bodies, he claimed, were the cost of being the only one in the room who understood the rules. That final statement became part of the record, a chilling reminder that some killers don't break. They think, they plan, and when they finally speak, it's not to say sorry, it's to explain how long they got away with it. Keith Hunter Jespersen became a textbook case not just for law enforcement, but for behavioral profilers. He operated alone, without help, without technology, without elaborate setups. He used opportunity, geography, and strength. He had no distinct victim type other than isolation, no rituals, no patterns of staging. His signature was the lack of chaos, clean, unflinching control. His smiley face letters, once mocked as childish, were later used in forensic linguistic analysis and handwriting comparisons that linked him to even more confessions. Though he sits behind bars now, serving life after life, investigators still occasionally revisit old cases that bear his mark. The happy face killer left more than victims. He left a blueprint, a trail of method over madness, and long after his arrest, his cold logic continues to unsettle even the most seasoned detectives. Some killers talk too much, others barely speak at all. Where Keith Jespersen left taunting messages, smiley faces, and confessions, Robert Schulman remained nearly invisible, a silent executioner who left his victims mutilated and discarded in pieces across New York. But silence doesn't mean lack of method. If anything, Schulman's calm made him more dangerous. He didn't need attention, he needed control. Between 1991 and 1996, Schulman left at least 5 women dead, and possibly more that were never recovered or confirmed. Unlike Jespersen, he wasn't mobile. Schulman lived and operated out of Long Island, where he worked nights at the post office sorting mail. It was the kind of job that gave him quiet, consistent access to isolation and anonymity. His murders were structured, rehearsed, and brutal in execution. His preferred method of killing was blunt force trauma to the head, often with a hammer or metal bar, followed by dismemberment. The process wasn't chaotic, it was intentional. Shulman struck his victims in the head multiple times until they fell unconscious or died from the initial impact. Then he moved them to his basement, where he used cutting tools to dismember the bodies. His work was not clean, but it was methodical. He wrapped parts in plastic and disposed of them in dumpsters, garbage bags, and alleyways across Queens and Long Island. Some torsos were burned, others were dumped intact. The goal was to make identification difficult, to reduce the victim to unrecognizable fragments and scatter them across unrelated locations. And it worked for a while. The police didn't know who they were dealing with. The first body was found in 1991, a headless, handless torso stuffed in a garbage bag, left behind a dumpster. No prints, no ID, just trauma and plastic. Forensic experts knew she had been struck repeatedly in the head, and that the removal of hands and face wasn't post-mortem rage, it was premeditated erasure. The second body appeared months later, same pattern. Then a third. All were women. All were dismembered, and all showed signs of being struck by the same kind of blunt object. The NYPD began to build a quiet file on what they suspected was a serial killer operating under the radar. But the victims had few connections. Most were transient or struggling, with no immediate ties to a common location or person. Shulman knew that. He picked victims who were vulnerable, alone, or on the edge of society. He often met them in poorer neighborhoods, lured them with small offers, and brought them back to his house under the guise of safety. Once inside, the attack was swift and fatal. No screaming, no struggle, just steel and bone. What made Shulman more dangerous than most wasn't the number of kills. It was the way he used his environment. He lived in a regular home on a regular street. He disposed of evidence right under the neighborhood's nose. He burned clothing in his fireplace. He dumped bodies near local buildings. He cleaned up with bleach and towels, then went back to his night shift at the post office like nothing happened. The house didn't reek of evil. It looked like a bachelor's residence. Cluttered, dull, unremarkable. Even his own brother, who sometimes stayed there, didn't know what was going on downstairs. But all patterns crack eventually. One body was found with part of a fingerprint that hadn't been fully burned. Another had a traceable article of clothing that hadn't been removed. Forensic teams began stitching details together. Eventually, Shulman slipped. One victim's blood was found in the trunk of a car registered to him. Then a bag was found with the exact same brand of duct tape and plastic wrap that was in his house. When the police finally closed in, they executed a search warrant on his Long Island home. Inside, they found blood traces in the basement, bone fragments in the drain, burn marks in the fireplace, a hammer in a plastic container under the floorboards, still stained. The freezer in his garage had red residue. The DNA matched 3 victims instantly. Under questioning, Shulman was expressionless. He didn't deny everything at first. He simply said he didn't remember. But the evidence spoke for him. His fingerprints matched the bag. His DNA was on the hammer. His basement matched the blood patterns. Shulman was arrested in 1996 and charged with 5 counts of second-degree murder. He was found guilty and sentenced to death, though later the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment without parole. His brother, who had lived with him for a period, was also charged as an accessory after the fact for helping dispose of evidence in one of the cases, though it was later argued whether he knew what he was part of. Shulman never showed remorse. He never explained the skills. He never confessed to more. He simply shut down. His silence was louder than a scream. What made the case even more chilling was how close he lived to everything. These weren't remote kills in dark forests. These were done in suburban homes, in a quiet neighborhood, behind drawn blinds. He wasn't clever with words. He didn't taunt the police. He didn't want recognition. He just wanted results. Blunt force head trauma, dismemberment, disposal, return to work. That was the cycle. And the fact that it continued for 5 years without anyone catching on, no leaks, no screaming, no complaints, is what kept detectives awake long after the trial. Unlike Jesperson, who moved with freedom and confessed for attention, Schulman stayed in one place and left his victims in pieces. If the first killer was a traveler who spread silence on wheels, the second was a neighbor who turned routine into a weapon. He died in prison in 2006, still silent, still unrepentant, leaving behind no explanation for the violence, only a basement filled with ghosts, and a hammer that once answered every question with a single swing. The arrest of Robert Schulman didn't make headlines immediately. There was no dramatic manhunt, no high-speed chase. It was a quiet knock on a modest door in a Long Island neighborhood, a warrant served, a man detained, and an entire investigation about to unravel in full. But once police stepped inside, they understood exactly what they were dealing with. The basement of Schulman's house didn't look like a torture chamber. There were no chains, no cages, no blood-stained walls. It was worse than that. It looked like a normal, unfinished basement, but one that had been carefully sterilized in places. Bleach stains marked corners. The drain was unnaturally clean, but forensics found minute traces of human remains beneath the surface grout. In the floorboards, they found a hammer wrapped in cloth, tucked inside a plastic storage bin. The handle still had dried skin fragments attached. The garage freezer wasn't full of food. It was unplugged but had dark residue around the seals. Blood spatter analysis showed consistent velocity patterns with blunt force trauma. A shovel found in the yard was rusted at the tip and carried both blood and soil from 2 different dump locations. All of it was quietly documented, photographed, bagged. And slowly, it all began to match back to missing women whose remains had been scattered across Queens and Long Island. One of the most damning pieces of evidence was a strand of synthetic hair from a wig that belonged to one victim, embedded deep in the trunk lining of Schulman's car. He had tried to vacuum it out, but it was lodged too far in. That strand, cross-matched with the exact synthetic blend from the manufacturer, tied him directly to the scene. In court, the case was built entirely around physical evidence. The prosecution didn't need a confession. They had DNA in the basement. They had matching brands of plastic bags, tape, rope, and a dismemberment pattern that was surgically consistent across multiple victims. They brought in forensic anthropologists who testified how the bone markings showed identical tool impressions, meaning the same cutting blade was used across at least 4 victims. They traced Schulman's employment records, noting that every single victim was last seen alive during one of his nights off. Surveillance footage showed his car near a known pickup location just hours before a victim vanished. The jury didn't deliberate long, but what disturbed even seasoned prosecutors was his complete lack of expression during trial. Schulman didn't speak. He didn't argue. He showed no remorse, no flicker of regret, no emotion. He simply sat there, hands folded, blinking slowly, as the forensic photos were displayed and the evidence stacked higher. His defense team didn't have much to argue. They claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that it could have been planted, that the timeline wasn't airtight. But the combination of DNA, blood trails, physical tools, and location tracking created a chain that was nearly impossible to break. His hammer matched, his car matched, his house matched, and his garbage matched. In his garbage bins, investigators had found burned patches of fabric containing partial blood patterns. When tested, 2 distinct female DNA profiles were recovered, that alone sealed the case. He was convicted of 5 counts of second-degree murder and sentenced to death in 1999. But New York State's death penalty was under legal challenge at the time, and his sentence was later commuted to life without parole. While in prison, Shulman was placed in protective custody, not because of any threats, but because of how quiet he was. Guards reported that he never spoke unless spoken to, never engaged with other inmates, and rarely reacted to anything. He read books, he cleaned his cell, he slept. That was all. There were rumors he killed more than 5. Some investigators believed there could be at least 3 or 4 other victims who were never recovered, bodies possibly disposed of in construction sites or remote locations that were later developed over. But without confessions, it was impossible to confirm. The only person who might have known more was his brother Barry, who was arrested as an accessory. Barry had helped dispose of one victim's belongings, including clothing and jewelry, and was charged for obstruction of justice. But in interviews he insisted he never knew the full truth, that he thought his brother was hiding drugs or stolen goods or just something embarrassing. He denied ever seeing the murders. Police couldn't prove otherwise, so Barry took a plea deal and served a short sentence. What stayed with detectives wasn't just the murders, it was the structure behind them. Shulman had created a kill system without ever speaking a word about it. He had a disposal process that involved fire, bleach, plastic, and waste. He picked specific days, cleaned specific areas, and left little to no human trace behind. But what ultimately exposed him wasn't a flaw in method, it was frequency. He kept killing, and each time he had to take shortcuts, reuse tools, rush cleanup, forget to fully sanitize. The wear on his hammer revealed repeated use. The DNA buildup in his trunk couldn't be wiped completely, and eventually all those micro errors led straight to his front door. He died in 2006 of natural causes while serving his sentence. His case is now archived as one of New York's most methodical serial murders in recent memory. No confessions, no motives, no grand reveals, just a hammer, a basement, and a trail of bodies disassembled with surgical hate. And as investigators closed the final file, they noted that the quietest killers leave the deepest marks. Not in screams or letters, but in the absence of answers that never come. Some killers wait in the dark, others come from it. As Robert Shulman sat in his basement in New York, dismembering bodies under a fluorescent bulb, another kind of predator was moving soundlessly across the country. Not in cars or neighborhoods, but along the forgotten veins of America, the railways. Angel Maturino Resendiz, later known as the Railroad Killer, didn't stalk one city. He stalked every place the tracks could carry him. Between 1997 and 1999, Resendiz moved through over a dozen U.S. states, slipping into communities via abandoned train depots and hopping freight cars under moonlight. His targets were random, his presence unnoticed, and his methods as quiet as they were brutal. What made Resendiz unique was his invisibility. He didn't own a vehicle, he didn't hold a job, he didn't use credit cards or leave any paper trail. He lived in the shadows of locomotives, slept under bridges, and moved across borders without being seen. But what began as trespassing turned into a string of horrific home invasions and murders that all followed a chilling routine. He would wait for nightfall, find a home close to the tracks, preferably one with little security or signs of isolation, and break in while the occupants slept. The kill itself was often improvised. Sometimes it was a blunt object found inside the house, a statue, a hammer, a pickaxe. Other times it was a knife taken from the victim's own kitchen. The common thread wasn't the weapon, it was the way he used it. Quick, sudden strikes aimed at the head and upper torso. No prolonged struggle, no theatrics, just silent death. Resendiz often covered his face with a scarf or towel during the kill, not to hide his identity from victims. They rarely lived long enough to report, but to avoid leaving hair or sweat behind. After the murders, he would sometimes linger just long enough to wash his hands or eat food from the refrigerator before vanishing back onto the tracks. One of his earliest known U.S. murders was in 1997 in Lexington, Kentucky. The body of a woman was found bludgeoned to death with a glass object from her own living room. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, and no witnesses. Police labeled it a random home invasion with little to go on. Then another case appeared months later in Texas. A couple killed in their home near a rail yard. Both struck in the head with a flat iron. Again, no prints, no clear motive, and no sign of the killer's entry or exit. Local investigators didn't yet realize they were dealing with a man who never traveled the roads. He followed steel and gravel. He moved by freight train, slipping off boxcars in the early hours and disappearing again before sunrise. The breakthrough came not from fingerprints, but from footprints. In one Texas murder, bloody shoe prints were found leading from the kitchen to the back door, then vanishing into the gravel near a local rail line. Those prints matched a rare Mexican brand of work boot not sold in the U.S., and they were later tied to a similar pair recovered in a rail yard in El Paso. But even with the print, the killer had no name. Then came a turning point. In 1999, Resendiz killed a Houston pastor by striking him with a claw hammer, then remained in the home long enough to eat a meal and write a cryptic note. Though he left no name, DNA from a bite mark on a piece of fruit matched earlier samples found at two other scenes. The killer's pattern, no vehicle, entry from the rear, murder with a found object, and silent escape by rail, became clearer. Investigators from different jurisdictions finally began cross-referencing cases along major rail lines, and a disturbing map emerged. Killings in Kentucky, Texas, Georgia, Illinois, and Florida, all within walking distance of freight stations, all carried out with sudden, overwhelming violence, all followed by complete disappearance. The FBI eventually placed Resendiz on its 10 most wanted fugitives list, circulating his image and alias to immigration checkpoints and rail depots. But the hunt was complicated. Resendiz had crossed the U.S.-Mexico border dozens of times. He used multiple identities, spoke several languages, and could vanish into rural terrain for weeks. His kills were not driven by money or revenge. He left cash and valuables untouched. He wanted only the control, the silence, the perfect, invisible execution. He was eventually tracked through a mix of DNA, border records, and an informant tip that connected his alias to a prior arrest. In July 1999, after pressure from law enforcement, his sister convinced him to surrender. He was arrested in El Paso, Texas, and charged with multiple counts of murder. During interrogation, Resendiz admitted to several of the crimes, not in remorse, but as a matter of fact. He described details only the killer could know: the angle of entry, the layout of the homes, the materials used. In one case, he remembered where he placed the weapon after the kill, behind a refrigerator. Police recovered it, blood still visible. At trial, Resendiz showed little emotion. He claimed at times that he was guided by spiritual forces or divine commands, but the evidence didn't care for motive. Blood, prints, tool marks, entry angles. Each crime scene became a puzzle that, once arranged, pointed only to him. He was convicted and sentenced to death in 2000. On June 27, 2006, he was executed by lethal injection in Texas. He made no final statement. In total, he is suspected of killing at least 15 people, though some investigators believe the number may be closer to 23, given the gaps in time, the ease of travel, and the number of unsolved murders near rail lines during that era. What made Resendiz so haunting wasn't just his body count. It was the way he turned the forgotten spaces of America, the railroads, the underpasses, the quiet towns, into a battlefield. He didn't leave behind messages or signatures. He didn't crave headlines. He wanted to kill and disappear. He wanted the world to sleep, not knowing he had passed through. And for a long time, it worked. Because by the time anyone realized he had been there, by the time the bodies were found and the crime scene cordoned off, Angel Maturino Resendiz was already 100 miles down the track, lying in the dark belly of a freight car, waiting for the next town, the next door left unlocked, the next silence to be broken. The final trail of blood left by Angel Maturino Resendiz wasn't what caught him. It was what tied the entire nightmare together. In one of his last confirmed killings, a 26-year-old woman was found beaten to death in her rural Texas home, just yards from the tracks. The object used was a fire poker, left partially embedded in her skull. What the killer didn't realize was that during his escape, a small cut on his palm had left a faint streak of blood on the doorknob. That trace, nearly invisible, held enough DNA to crack the case. The match came back to a prior alias used by a man arrested at the US-Mexico border years earlier. That alias linked to fingerprints. The fingerprints matched prints from a Georgia murder scene, then from Kentucky, then Illinois, and finally, it was clear. All these seemingly random murders were the work of one man, riding the rails like a phantom, striking without pattern, but always with purpose. The FBI began constructing a heat map of murders within a quarter-mile radius of active rail lines. It revealed a grotesque constellation, dozens of unsolved killings, all tethered to a moving shadow. As agents retraced each scene, they saw the same signature without a name: entry through the rear or side of homes, sudden blunt force trauma, signs of a short stay, an eaten meal, a moved chair, and always a silent exit back toward the tracks. It was mobility that had made him invisible. Forensic analysts pored over trace evidence left at these homes: footprints from a rare brand of boots, carpet fibers, blood smears, partial shoe patterns. A forensic odontologist confirmed bite patterns on discarded fruit in one kitchen, matched impressions found at a different scene 700 miles away. The details, once meaningless in isolation, suddenly formed a pattern of habit. It wasn't just murder, it was practiced, refined, repeated. And then came the break no one expected: his sister. In June 1999, after learning of the manhunt and the FBI's placement of her brother on the most wanted list, Resendiz's sister contacted law enforcement. She feared he would never stop. Negotiations were coordinated carefully, involving FBI agents, Texas Rangers, and U.S. Marshals. After days of phone communication and a promise of safety for his family, she convinced Resendiz to surrender on the bridge between El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. No weapons, no resistance, just a thin, silent man walking forward in chains. What followed in the courtroom felt like theater performed in a vacuum. Resendiz rarely spoke. When he did, his words were measured and dispassionate. He described killings as if recounting a dream: a flash of entry, a strike to the head, a quick departure. There was no hate in his tone, no urgency, no regret. Psychological evaluations noted he showed signs of delusional thinking, claiming at times that his victims were evil or that their spirits remained with him. But the prosecution didn't pursue an insanity plea. They had blood, they had DNA, they had dozens of tools, all bearing his prints, found across multiple homes. The jury didn't deliberate long. He was convicted in 2000 for the brutal murder of physician Claudia Benton in Houston, a case where his DNA was found on the windowsill, his fingerprints on her belongings, and his boot prints leading out toward the rail line. Prosecutors described him as a man who used the nation's railways as his hunting ground, and the judge concurred. He was sentenced to death. While awaiting execution, Resendiz was transferred to death row in Livingston, Texas. He remained quiet in prison, reading religious texts, avoiding other inmates, and refusing most interviews. When the date of execution neared, he made no attempt to appeal. On June 27, 2006, he was led into the execution chamber. He offered no final words. Witnesses said he looked upward, closed his eyes, and never opened them again. But his death didn't bring closure. Not fully. Investigators across the country continued to revisit cold cases near railway lines. Some believe Resendez's true victim count may be double the confirmed number, perhaps even triple. His method, fast, improvisational, brutal, left little evidence unless he made a mistake, and most of the time, he didn't. It was only the relentless work of forensic teams, blood pattern analysts, and geographic profilers that finally unmasked a killer who had made silence his greatest weapon. What stayed with law enforcement wasn't the horror of the crime scenes, though those were unforgettable, but the sheer scale of his reach. A man with no car, no job, no home, and no resources had managed to outmaneuver the entire criminal justice system for years simply by riding boxcars and choosing victims who never knew he was near. He was never seen walking down a street, never caught on store cameras. He was a ghost with a blood-stained map, and only the sound of his boots on gravel gave him away. In the end, it wasn't technology that stopped him. It was family. It was a sister who feared what he had become, and it was a law enforcement community that finally looked beyond city lines and realized the killer they were chasing didn't need roads, just a rail and a reason. Resendez may have used the tracks to vanish, but some killers disappear behind walls of wealth and civility, hiding their brutality in plain sight. As federal agents closed the file on the railroad killer, another predator was already dissolving into the manicured shadows of suburban Indiana, one who didn't need to run. Herbert Baumeister didn't hop boxcars or slip across state lines. He built a castle around himself. A quiet man with thinning hair, business casual shirts, and a strained but functional family life, Baumeister owned a successful chain of thrift stores in the early 1990s. He lived on a sprawling 18-acre estate called Fox Hollow Farm, nestled on the edge of Indianapolis, surrounded by trees, privacy, and silence. To most, he was eccentric but harmless, a man who donated to charities, avoided confrontation, and kept to himself. But under the surface was a cold, methodical killer whose backyard would eventually yield a horror so dense that authorities spent months cataloging bones. The true depth of his method began with how invisible he made himself. Baumeister preyed on people who lived at the margins of society, often targeting men who frequented the local bar scene, especially along areas known for transient foot traffic and isolated nightlife. These men weren't traced. They didn't always carry ID. Some were never reported missing. Baumeister's strategy was precise. He would initiate casual contact in public places, observe behavior, gauge vulnerability, and then bring them back to his estate under the pretense of brief interaction. What happened afterward followed a disturbing pattern: sudden overpowering, swift asphyxiation, and meticulous disposal. The kill itself was not messy. There were no gunshots, no visible trauma to the body in many cases. He preferred strangulation, a method that gave him total control, left little blood, and erased resistance in minutes. But the aftermath is what revealed his deeper pathology. Rather than panic or flee, Baumeister treated the crime scenes as if they were routine maintenance. He moved the bodies to the back of his estate, into a wooded section, shielded by brush and elevation. There, he dismembered remains with mechanical efficiency. Bones were burned in shallow pits, ashes were buried beneath mulch, and scattered in drainage ditches. The evidence was treated like yard waste, not in contempt, but as calculated erasure. Investigators would later find hundreds of bone fragments, some charred, some fully intact, from at least 11 different individuals. But the murders didn't cause panic while they were happening. That was the terrifying part. Baumeister's public image remained intact. His wife described him as odd, but functional. Neighbors found him distant, but quiet. Police didn't link the missing persons cases together at first because there were no scenes of struggle. The victims vanished without a trace, and since many lived transient lifestyles, disappearances were often delayed in reporting. It was only after one of the victims' friends launched a private investigation that patterns began to emerge. Names, locations, and last sightings all converging around the same side of Indianapolis. At the time, no one suspected Baumeister, partly because he owned property and ran businesses. The illusion of stability kept suspicion away, but behind the walls of Fox Hollow Farm, the truth had already begun to rot into the soil. What triggered the final investigation was a tip. Someone who had escaped his grasp and reported eerie similarities between his experience and the details of the disappearances. With that information, police began watching Baumeister's property. They waited for an opportunity to investigate legally, and when his wife filed for divorce, she granted law enforcement permission to search the grounds. What they found shattered all previous assumptions. In a shallow area behind the house were piles of bone shards, vertebrae, teeth, and skull fragments, many fused by heat. Medical examiners were forced to reconstruct identities piece by piece, and in several cases, the remains were too damaged to identify. But DNA linked at least 4 victims to Baumeister's property. He wasn't arrested immediately. When the investigation intensified and search warrants expanded, Baumeister fled the state. He crossed into Ontario, Canada, alone, leaving his businesses behind. His car was later found in a remote area near Lake Huron. Inside, a single typed note. No confession, no apology, just vague acknowledgments and instructions for his body. Days later, he was found dead by suicide, a self-inflicted gunshot wound. It was a coward's end to a pattern of calculated horror. Law enforcement never got a full statement from him. No map of burial sites, numbered names of additional victims. Just a property full of bones and a man-shaped void where justice should have been. To this day, the full number of people Herbert Baumeister killed is unknown. Estimates range from 11 to over 20. Some investigators believe he may be tied to disappearances across multiple states, not because of his travel habits, but because he frequented certain interstate hubs and quietly operated during the same years that others vanished without trace. But what makes his case so disturbing isn't just the death toll, it's the silence between murders. The way he returned to work, the way he hosted family gatherings while skeletal remains lay yards away. It was suburban murder disguised as monotony, and for years it worked. Because some monsters don't wear shadows. They wear name tags and keep trimmed hedges. And sometimes they bury the dead in their own backyard, where no one thinks to look. The bones behind Fox Hollow Farm didn't scream. They whispered, from dirt, from ash, from the corners of a property so carefully curated, it took trained forensic teams weeks just to know where to begin. When investigators were finally granted access to the estate, they expected at most a few burial sites. What they found was something closer to a fragmented graveyard. Beneath layers of soil and landscaping mulch were thousands of bone fragments, some as small as pebbles, others still partially intact, many charred from hasty fires set years earlier. The backyard looked normal from a distance. Up close, it was a forensic excavation site. Tents, gridded tarps, gloved hands sifting through dirt that hid the ends of lives no one had been looking for. The process wasn't just gruesome. It was exhausting. Every fragment had to be cataloged, logged, and examined. Forensic anthropologists began piecing together the remains like grotesque puzzles, using bone density, fusion, and wear patterns to estimate age and sex. Dental records, when available, helped narrow down matches, but many of the men Baumeister killed had no dental records. No one even knew they were dead. DNA helped fill in some blanks, confirming matches to missing persons cases previously filed across Indiana and neighboring states. But it wasn't enough. Some bones belonged to victims never reported missing. Others were so degraded by time and fire that identification proved impossible. The total confirmed victim count sat at 11. The estimated number was higher. Some placed it near 20, others closer to 30. The full truth was likely buried deeper, not just in soil, but in silence. As this evidence mounted, Baumeister's mental state began to shift. Those closest to him noticed erratic behavior. He was sleeping less, making cryptic comments. At one point, he claimed the investigation was a witch hunt, though no formal charges had yet been filed. His business began to falter, his marriage collapsed, and when law enforcement began closing in with active warrants and expanded search rights, Baumeister did not wait to be handcuffed. He vanished. Driving north alone, he crossed into Ontario, Canada, abandoning his phone and bank cards. For weeks, his whereabouts were unknown. His car was eventually discovered in Pinery Provincial Park, parked near a densely wooded area. Inside, police found supplies, printed maps, a small stack of cash, and a typed note. The note was not a confession. It made no mention of the victims or the investigation. Instead, it offered vague reflections on personal failure and requested that his body be handled quietly. Days later, a hiker stumbled upon his corpse lying beneath a tree canopy, a single gunshot wound to the head. No struggle, no message scrawled in blood, just the quiet end of a man who had buried more than bones. The death of Herbert Baumeister brought a sense of finality, but not justice. He died without admitting guilt, without identifying the men whose remains lay scattered across his property, without facing a trial that would have forced him to stand before the families he shattered. And because of that, some cases tied to Fox Hollow Farm remain open to this day. Bones, too, burned to yield DNA, faces never reconstructed, names never spoken. Investigators continued fielding calls for years after his death, relatives of missing persons wondering if their brother, son, or partner might have ended up under his garden. Some inquiries led nowhere. Others pointed to compelling circumstantial links, but in the absence of living testimony or complete remains, most would remain forever unresolved. Herbert Baumeister had, in the most cowardly way, stolen not just lives, but answers. What made his case so disturbing was the duality, the killer and the disguise. He wasn't a drifter or someone previously known to law enforcement. He was a business owner, a father, a man who held holiday parties while decomposing skeletons lay beneath his soil. There were no warning signs that the public could see, no arrest record, no violent outbursts. He blended in because he had built a life designed to shield him from scrutiny, and it worked. For years, the contrast between appearance and reality, between the manicured lawn and the burned bone fragments, was what truly haunted those who investigated him. He made murder look like routine, disposal look like cleanup, and himself look like nothing at all. And then he was gone, gone before indictments, gone before confrontation, gone before justice. But not all monsters choose silence. Some of them don't hide in forest parks or vanish across borders. Some of them return to the scene again and again, taunting the system, watching the panic unfold from the shadows. The final killer. In this sequence didn't run. He adapted, he evolved, he stayed close, and made every murder feel like a message. F. Baumeister hid his depravity behind the rituals of suburban life. Then Wesley Allen Dodd was the opposite, a predator with no disguise, who functioned not by fitting in, but by carefully avoiding attention altogether. By the early 1990s, the state of Washington had become Dodd's silent hunting ground. He didn't operate with rage or impulse. He wasn't chaotic. Every move was rehearsed. Every failure became a learning curve. He viewed murder as a craft that could be refined. His earliest preparations revealed a mind obsessed with control, handwritten notes cataloging ideal locations, escape routes, and victim profiles, tools hidden in his car for rapid abduction, and routines designed to minimize witnesses. He didn't wander into violence. He walked straight toward it, map in hand. His targets were chosen with methodical consistency, children in public places with weak supervision and repeat patterns. Dodd scouted parks, playgrounds, and school routes, studying patterns, watching from a distance until he felt the routine was predictable enough to exploit. He approached victims with calm confidence, often under the guise of helpfulness or casual interaction. The abductions were swift and quiet. No weapons were needed. Only the force of surprise and precision. His killings were controlled and sequential. He did not mutilate or leave chaotic scenes. His goal was to end life with efficiency, erase evidence, and vanish. In the first instance, 2 young brothers disappeared from a park in Vancouver, Washington. Their bodies were discovered later, posed and staged in a way that suggested premeditated design. Police were baffled. No witnesses, no screams, no forensic evidence. Just 2 boys who had vanished in daylight and were later found lifeless, placed deliberately. Days later, another child disappeared from a theater restroom, another quiet location, another calculated choice. The patterns were forming, but the randomness of location made it difficult to link. Dodd documented everything. He kept journals with chilling notations about the acts themselves, the mistakes made, and how he would do better next time. He wrote about timing, about how long he had between sighting and approach, about how certain neighborhoods reacted slower than others. These weren't rage-filled rants. They were clinical, as if he were reviewing a business strategy. He wasn't in it for thrills. He was testing how long he could stay ahead. What made him more dangerous was his ability to maintain complete composure in public. He lived modestly, didn't attract suspicion, and stayed on the move enough to prevent local familiarity. Each murder was followed by a return to quiet routine. No sudden absences, no breakdowns, just a methodical return to observation, to hunting. But it was a single failure that unraveled him. In the fall of 1989, Dodd attempted another abduction near the same area as his first kills. This time, the child resisted. A fight ensued. Witnesses intervened. Dodd fled, but not fast enough. A description of his vehicle, license plate, and appearance quickly reached law enforcement. He was arrested within hours. What followed was not a prolonged denial or evasion. It was confession, not out of guilt, but out of certainty that the game was over. In custody, Dodd admitted everything. He described the murders with clinical detail, not exaggerating, not minimizing, just recounting, as if he were reading back reports. His journals were seized, and inside, investigators found full diagrams, plans for future abductions, and a deeply disturbing blueprint for a private torture chamber he had hoped to build in his apartment. Physical evidence from the crime scenes matched his accounts. The chain of proof was airtight, but what stunned prosecutors was his attitude. He showed no remorse, no sadness. He offered full cooperation, not out of repentance, but because he believed it was logical. He expressed no interest in appealing his sentence. In fact, he requested execution and asked that it be carried out swiftly. He did not want life imprisonment. He wanted a conclusion. When the trial ended, he was sentenced to death. The method would be hanging, the first judicial hanging in the U.S. in nearly 3 decades. Dodd accepted it. No protest, no delay. He was executed in January 1993, standing motionless as the noose was lowered. For some, his death brought closure. For others, it left a lingering unease. Because unlike killers driven by rage or delusion, Dodd operated with clarity. He made no attempt to justify himself through trauma or ideology. He simply did what he wanted to do until he was caught. His obsession wasn't fame, it wasn't even violence, it was control. Total, undetected control over life and death. And had he not slipped up once, he might have continued, unnoticed, for years. But even the most calculated systems eventually misfire. Even the most precise minds leave cracks. And for every Dodd or Baumeister who gets caught, there are others, quieter, colder, still perfecting their routine, still watching, still waiting. When investigators finally had time to review the full contents of Wesley Allen Dodd's journals, the horror shifted from what he did to how he thought. Page after page revealed not the ravings of a madman, but the procedures of a technician. He had designed flowcharts, not with ink, but with intent. He tracked victim locations, logged time intervals between sightings and approaches, and even self-critiqued failed attempts to improve his timing. The journals read more like behavioral audits than confessions. For law enforcement, it was unsettling not just because of the crimes, but because of what they learned about control, patience, and strategy. Dodd wasn't driven by panic or delusion. He operated like someone solving a problem, testing for weaknesses in everyday security, adjusting his actions to meet evolving constraints. The implications were broader than one case. Investigators began using Dodd's writings to re-examine cold cases, especially those with subtle consistencies. Clean abductions, quiet scenes, zero witnesses. If anything, his arrest redefined a class of killer often missed by traditional profiling. The ultra-methodical operator who doesn't fit into frenzied violence or classic trauma cycles. He created his own rules and followed them religiously. His self-requested execution further disturbed many. It wasn't remorseful. He didn't seek punishment. He simply saw the game as over. In fact, Dodd publicly requested the death penalty and waived all appeals, stating the court process would only delay the inevitable. His attitude was not sorrow, it was finality, cold, calculated, like flipping the last page in a binder. Officials preparing his execution noted his composure. No outbursts, no second thoughts. On the day of his hanging, the first U.S. hanging in decades, he stood still, spoke clearly, and showed no regret. Some who witnessed it expected a breakdown, a humanizing moment. It never came. The noose was lowered, the platform dropped, and silence replaced closure. Public reaction split sharply. Some saw it as justice, the system operating as it should. Others were unnerved, not by the death itself, but by how little resistance he gave it. There was no clawing for mercy, no last-minute declarations. Just a man who had calculated risk and reward down to his final breath. His execution reopened debate about how we understand evil, not when it screams, but when it whispers. Dodd's death left no unanswered questions, but it didn't leave peace either. Because his case suggested something far more dangerous than rage. It suggested intent. Cold, quiet intent. And that kind of predator rarely draws attention. They live quietly, plan privately, and act with minimal noise. Dodd had shown that monsters could be rational, that brutality could be rehearsed, that the public's fear of chaos was sometimes misplaced. The truly dangerous weren't reckless, they were efficient. In the years following his case, behavioral analysts rewrote risk models to include this strategic archetype. Killers who avoided outbursts, who studied before acting, who didn't kill from emotion, but from structure. Dodd's name appeared in training programs as a case study not of psychosis, but of calculation. His lack of remorse became part of the profile, not because it was rare, but because it came without pretense. He never claimed to be sick. He never claimed to be driven by pain. He simply said what he did and accepted what came. His journals remained in sealed evidence files, not as trophies, but as warnings. For investigators, they became blueprints for prevention, not by predicting specific acts, but by learning the rhythm of how some killers move. Not loud, not messy, just precise. In the end, Wesley Allen Dodd didn't haunt because he got away with it. He haunted because he almost did, because his entire plan could have continued had a single moment not slipped out of his control. And that final fact echoed the same truth behind every killer in this series. No matter how long the silence, no matter how perfect the mask, no matter how many victims go unnoticed, time eventually breaks pattern. But even time is a slow hunter. And some killers are faster. Some don't wait to be discovered. Some adaptations. And by the time you see the pattern, they're already gone. Because justice can hang a man, but it can't always catch the next one in time. None of them shouted. None of them raged. The monsters you've just seen didn't explode into chaos. They operated in silence, in structure, in steps. They weren't screaming in alleyways or leaving trails of blood through cities. They were watching from the edges of crowds, parking a little farther down the street, stepping into public spaces with just enough anonymity to become invisible. They weren't chasing the rush of violence. They were chasing the perfect routine, one without interruption, one that folded neatly into ordinary life. That's what makes them different. That's what makes them dangerous. Not the cruelty of what they did, but the fact that they built it into their day like anyone else builds in coffee or traffic or lunch breaks. Each of them rehearsed. Each of them adjusted. They didn't kill when angry. They killed when prepared. And the only thing that stopped them wasn't some hero moment or breakthrough technology. It was cracks, tiny, quiet cracks in a system that was almost airtight. A witness who paid attention, a victim who fought back, a camera they didn't expect. It wasn't justice that found them, it was luck. And luck runs out both ways. Think about how they moved. Parks, offices, homes, rest stops. Places where children play, where co-workers gather, where families go to feel safe. Now think about how they left, empty-handed, undetected, and ready to return the next day. Not to gloat, not to brag, just to keep watching. Because that's what haunts most after these cases. Not the murders, but the spaces between them. The weeks where nothing happened, the months where they were home, quiet, going to work, shopping for groceries, waving to neighbors. They weren't hiding in shadows. They were living beside you. That's how they got away with it. By being so normal, they disappeared into the background. And if that doesn't unsettle you, look again. Because it wasn't just their methods that connected them. It was their patience. They waited for systems to fail. They didn't make bold moves. They made quiet ones. Ones that slipped under alarms and beneath assumptions. Not because they were smarter, but because they knew most people don't look twice at someone who smiles. And the terrifying question isn't how they killed. It's how many more just haven't been caught. How many others learned from them. How many are still learning now. That's the part that makes your skin crawl. The idea that the most dangerous people in the world don't set off alarms. They don't wave red flags. They don't stumble or scream or bleed their intentions. They study. They adapt. They take notes. And when they're done, they don't gloat. They blend. And the line between you and them is thinner than you think. Because evil doesn't wear a mask. Sometimes it wears glasses, or carries a lunchbox, or walks the dog. It waits quietly, listening for opportunity, not attention. And long after headlines fade and documentaries are filmed and bodies are buried, it remains, not in a name, but in a method. That's what law enforcement knows now. That's what changed after killers like these. The idea that you don't only hunt blood, you hunt pattern, you hunt behavior. You look not for who panics, but who never does. Because the most unsettling thing about every killer we've seen is that none of them needed chaos to survive. They needed silence, and the world gives them plenty. So next time you're in a park, or on a bus, or waiting in a parking lot at dusk, ask yourself not who's watching you, but who's waiting. Because monsters don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they pass you a receipt, or hold the elevator, or sit quietly just out of frame. And by the time anyone notices, they're already gone. You've already walked past them, and they watched you.